following program is brought to you in conjunction with the folks at Grace to All with Paul Gray. Now we bring to you the Agape Guy Show with your host, Lenny Manning.
I'm banking everything on love. I'm banking everything on love.
Hello and welcome to the Agape Guy Show. I'm your host, Lenny Manning. Today I'm going to be talking about another issue that I'd like to reassess or deconstruct a bit more. I've seen a few people ask questions about the issue of hell, and I think it needs to be discussed a bit more. I've also seen some other people question why some people doubt the traditional view of hell. Some people also wonder why some folks doubt that there's eternal conscious torment in hell. Some people pointed out a few verses that seemed to point to eternal conscious torment in hell, and I'd like to look at these issues. So I've invited a friend to the show so we can talk about this issue and these types of questions. I'm going to be talking to my friend who wrote a few books. Now, on his books, he lists the author's name as an anonymous follower of Jesus. He wanted to be anonymous to avoid verbal abuse from his family, so I will be helping him stay anonymous. I'll be disguising his face and his voice on this episode. I can also say that I worked with him as he wrote a couple of different books. One of his books was titled Why I Had to Consider Universal Reconciliation. The other is titled My Religion's Deconstruction Discoveries. He addressed a few different tough issues in those books. Both of those are on Amazon's website as well. You can simply look up those titles and you should be able to find them. So today I'd like to discuss with him this tough issue about hell. I'd like to discuss some of the questions and objections posed to people that have serious doubts about eternal conscious torment in hell. So without further ado, here is our guest. Hello, Mr. Anonymous.
Hello, Lenny. Thanks for having me on the show again and mentioning those books.
I'll tell you what, I'm so glad to have you back here again that I can barely contain myself.
Oh, wow, thanks. I'm glad to be here.
You're welcome. Now, I'd have to say that I've seen some questions and comments on social media recently that seem to be a bit rough. Here are 4 things that a few different people brought up and I shared with you ahead of time. 1, someone said that hell is mentioned in the Bible, and so they act like it's inconceivable that some folks don't believe in some form of hell or traditional views of hell like they do. 2, someone else said that the Bible does mention eternal judgment, so those who don't believe in hell are wrong and way off base. They mention that there are verses in Hebrews chapter 6 that mention eternal judgment. So they seem to say that hell definitely is real. Number 3, another person mentioned that the King James Bible and modern translations like the New International Version and the New American Standard Bible mention hell as well. So they don't seem to understand how people can discard these Bible verses that mention hell. And number 4, another person mentioned Matthew chapter 25 where it refers to the sheep and goats. They commented that in verse 41, the goats are said to be cursed and sent to eternal fire that's prepared for the devil and his angels. So how can people doubt hell when this seems to say hell is real and those people are sent to hell to be tortured for eternity? So what about all these tough questions? I've sent you these questions ahead of time, so I want to know how you would give an answer to these questions and statements like this.
Well, there's a lot of different issues here that are from several different parts of the Bible. There are also several different issues that are being addressed in these different books of the Bible. So let's take these one at a time and try to get a better view of these parts of the Bible. Now, before we start, let's just remind folks of a few things. Even highly respected and reputable theologians say that reasonable Christians can disagree about these things. Those people with different opinions about hell are within acceptable forms of Christianity and Christian teaching. So let's all refrain from calling people names or accusing them of being heretics. People on differing sides of this issue are not engaging in heresy, nor are they cultists. They really don't fit the criteria for heresy. It's the same with the issue of universal reconciliation, and that people on both sides are within acceptable forms of Christianity. Although in my opinion, we should all consider that almost all reputable theology professors teach that love is God's nature. So we should stick with that as our guide as we consider these other issues. I can also let everyone know that even the early Christians believed different things about the issue of hell. There were actually 6 schools of thought on this issue in the early church, and there was a little bit of a mixture in each one of those 6 groups. Yet, generally, this is how it was laid out. 4 of those schools of thought believed in some form of universal reconciliation, and didn't believe in eternal punishment in hell. One other school of thought believed in annihilationism. That means they thought that evil people had their spirits wiped out of existence after they died. So it was as if they ceased to exist. We should recognize that almost all reputable theologians and theology professors teach that love is God's nature. So, since love is God's nature, that should lean in a good direction to point us toward a good view of this subject.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. My theology professor taught that love is God's nature as well.
Yep. Well, that sounds like a good place to start. So let's start with the verses on this issue that you mentioned in the book of Hebrews. If you look up these verses in an interlinear Bible, like the one you can find on BibleHub.com, you can see some interesting things. The interlinear Bible has the original words from the original languages listed above the English words. You can also click on those original words and look up the meanings of those words in Strong's Concordance. So if we look up the words used for eternal and judgment, you might find some interesting meanings of the words. There are big differences and discrepancies in the meanings of the words that show some big problems. If a person uses these to say there truly is eternal conscious torment in hell, then there's a problem. First, let's read Hebrews 6 verses 1 through 2. In an NASB version, it says this: "Therefore, leaving the elementary teaching about the Christ, let us press on to maturity, not laying again a foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith toward God, of instruction about washings and laying on of hands, and about the resurrection of the dead and eternal judgment." Let me point out some of the mistranslations, misinterpretations, misuses, and misunderstandings of these verses. First of all, the word that seems to be translated as eternal doesn't really mean eternal. The original word that's used there is aeonu, which means a time or a period of time. So it doesn't really mean eternal. Even J.I. Packer, who believed in eternal punishment in hell, said that this word shouldn't be interpreted as eternal in passages like this. So at best, it's a mistranslation or misinterpretation. At its worst, it might be manipulated to fit the translator's personal theological bias and opinions. So now, let's look at that second word that's translated as the word judgment. If you look up the original meaning of the original word that was used, it was the word krimatos. Other Bible passages use the word kolossus. Yet the word krimatos means a decision, or to make a decision. The second word, kolossus, refers to gardening, or should I say, pruning a tree to make it grow better or produce more fruit. So neither of those words imply eternal punitive punishment, at least not from what I can see. It seems to imply one of two possibilities. Either it's one person who makes a decision in this lifetime to start seeing God as loving, and thus the kingdom within comes alive. So the Holy Spirit starts doing incredible things in the person's life, so they have a higher quality of life. That higher quality of life is usually about the fruit of the Spirit, inner peace, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, possibly miraculous gifts of the Spirit, and or miraculous answers to prayers. It could also be the second possibility of a potential decision. This would be number 2, which is that the person has a post-mortem experience and they see that God is loving, so they decide to embrace that as the truth and join with God. This could be similar to a near-death experience, or NDE. It could be that their spirit steps out of their body and another spirit walks up to them and tells them that God is loving. Then also tells them that God takes everyone into heaven. Maybe it could also be like NDEs, where a bright light emanating from God purifies the person to make them fit for heaven. So perhaps God's light washes away any angst, bad attitudes, or bad behaviors. So then they are fit to be loving toward all people in heaven. Some people might ask how they can get into heaven without any punishment for their sins. So here's what I would suggest we look at to answer that question. First of all, I'd respond by saying some of the same things I've heard and learned from other people who study this issue. First, no one really gets away with so-called sinful behaviors. You see, sinful behaviors always carry their own consequences, such as if you often drink too many drinks with alcohol in them, you could end up with severe liver problems. If you often get into drunken bar fights, you could end up severely injured, or you might end up with a fatal injury. Then again, if you sleep around too much, you could get an STD. You could also end up in a state of painful brokenheartedness or remorse. So, nobody really gets away with anything. Besides, if you're trying to make sure no one gets away with anything, I think you're looking for vengeance. That decisively isn't God's way of dealing with these issues. That doesn't align with God's love at all. We also need to recognize that God's judgment is redemptive and not punitive. I'd also say that since no one is perfect, almost all people don't want to be punished as bad as they want other people to be punished. So that shows they seek vengeance and not loving correction that brings redemption, restoration, reconciliation, and healing. You could also look at Philippians 2 verses 10 through 11 to get some more insight on this type of redemptive correction. That's the somewhat famous verse that says, "Every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord." Well, the translator left out a word that was in all the ancient manuscripts. The verse should read, "Every knee shall bow and every tongue shall joyfully confess that Jesus is Lord." So if people are getting thrown into torment in hell, how could they ever possibly confess to this in a joyful manner? It couldn't possibly happen at all. Even if you look at it from an end-of-the-world scenario where people are conquered, how could that possibly happen? If people are thrown down on the ground with a boot firmly holding their head in the dirt, how could they joyfully confess anything? You might be able to torture them and get them to say something, but there's no way to make them joyfully proclaim it. So punitive punishment isn't going to resolve that type of situation. Neither could conquering someone by military force get them to joyfully accept a hated opponent. So neither punitive punishment or the threat of eternal torture could fix the problem. Yet God's redemptive correction, which can be done lovingly, is the one thing that can actually fix the issue. So right now, let's look at the results of the words decision and time period getting used together in that verse in Hebrews. If they're both used together, here's what it seems to mean. It's the concept of a time or time period to make a decision. So it could be a time for God to help you grow more and or be more productive. That sounds a lot more reasonable. Let's go further and ask ourselves a more beneficial question. The question is this: what decision could we make on an issue that could make us mature a bit more or become more productive? That's a good question that brings us to a much better perspective. I believe that we need to make a decision on whether we believe God truly is pure love and goodness or not. Otherwise, do we believe God's love is counterbalanced by his anger and wrath? Then again, could this concept of an angry and vengeful God actually be a false notion? So God's nature is love, but anger and wrath are not his nature, so they cannot possibly counterbalance his love. I can tell you that reputable theology professors teach that love is God's nature, yet they don't teach that anger and wrath are God's nature. So the truth of the matter is that love is God's nature. So God is pure love and goodness. Many people have a false view of an alleged angry God, so they should go to their favorite Christian college and ask the theology professor about this issue. They need to ask the professor if love is God's nature, and then ask if anger and wrath are God's nature. Since God is only pure love, those other things cannot possibly counterbalance God's love, since they are not his nature. So we need to see how this applies to this subject of hell. The idea of God eternally torturing people is a direct slander against God's character, and that love is God's nature. God's nature is a primary doctrine, and to discard it or alter it by adding anger and wrath would severely alter a primary doctrine. So it would be stepping outside of primary Christian doctrine to claim God's love is balanced by his anger and wrath. Yet most folks don't realize that they have actually stepped away from a primary doctrine. So they don't realize that they would fit the criteria for what some people would call heresy. Not that I want to call people harsh names, even though typical theologians would say that that ideology would fit the criteria of a heretical teaching. Yet these same folks accuse other people of being heretics when they themselves have drifted into it. It makes me laugh a little because it's so silly. It's a bit funny, but it's also a bit tragic that people are so illiterate about God's nature and character. Let me also say that I don't want to call people names here, so I don't want to call people heretics or cultists. So let's try to be loving and kind to people, instead of being so harsh with our words. Yet let's move on and look at another objection people bring up. I think we skipped one, the KJV Bible, the NIV, and the NASB all mentioning the word hell. So let's look at that issue.
Yeah, let's look at that one.
Well, first off, if you look at several Bible translations printed over the last 300 years or so, most don't mention hell. If you look at the original languages, they are quite well justified in not using the word hell. So let's look at the Old King James and the New King James and compare those two. The Old KJV used the term hell 31 times in the Old Testament, 23 in the New Testament, and so that's a total of 54 times it gets used. The New King James used the word hell only 19 times in the Old Testament and 13 in the New Testament, which is a total of 32 times it gets used. So what happened to make them stop using it in 22 different places? Well, some of those occasions were in the Old Testament where the word Sheol was used. The word hell should not be used in place of the word Sheol anywhere. I still don't know why they left 19 references in there. Now, the word Sheol has a twofold meaning. One is that it's the place of the dead, yet you could say that there's two different places of the dead, so to speak. One is the grave where you put a deceased person's body. The other is what some people would call the invisible place. The invisible place refers to spirits going to a place that we living, breathing people cannot see while we are in our physical bodies. Sheol had nothing to do with a place of fiery eternal torment and punitive punishment. So calling it hell is definitely a bad translation. So they rightly got rid of those references in the New King James, but they should have also got rid of the other 19 as well. Some other versions of the Bible left out the word hell from the New Testament for good reasons as well. Let me explain what those reasons are. It's usually due to the original word being the word Gehenna, which is a reference to a literal place outside of Jerusalem. It's in the Valley of Hinnom. These days, there's actually a park there with nice green grass with bushes and trees. From what I understand, some people go there to have cookouts and picnics. So there's no reason to legitimately call that by the term hell. Let me further explain some of those references. As some people point out, Jerusalem was conquered in 70 AD and many dead bodies were taken to the valley and burned. That was prophesied in the book of Matthew as the end of the time of the temple's existence. So it isn't about a future where people are sent to eternal torment in hell. Some people might consider a similar reference to the lake of fire in the book of Revelation, but that's not fully accurate. It might even be a bit of a mistranslation or misinterpretation as well. That actually refers to God purifying us humans so we are fit to enter heaven. That likely refers to the time of decision that I mentioned earlier, where we see God's love. So that doesn't refer to eternal punishment in hell either. So this is why many translations of the Bible don't use the word hell at all. It isn't that they were trying to mislead people by getting rid of the word hell. It was actually due to the original words used in these verses that don't justify using the word hell. If anyone wants to get a good book that references a lot of this, they should get the book Hope Beyond Hell by Gerry Beauchemin.
Yeah, that book is on Amazon, and there's a legitimately free audiobook version on the website called learnoutloud.com. Folks might need to sign up for a free account, but then they can download the audiobook for free. There are other good books on this subject as well, like Don Keathley's book, Hell's Illusion, and Julie Furwerda's book, Raising Hell, and Eaton Barr's book teaching series, which is called Hell, a Jewish Perspective on a Christian Doctrine. Eaton Barr is a Jewish Christian theologian, and his material is very good. You can also find his teaching series on YouTube and listen to the audio version. So, Mr. Anonymous, what did you want to look at next exactly?
Yep. Well, I think the next question was the situation with Matthew 25. The situation with Matthew 25 is a different issue than some people think it's talking about. Some people might think it's talking about different people who are symbolized as sheep and goats. They think it means that they will be separated and the bad people will get sent to eternal torment. Yet that isn't necessarily what it's talking about. It could be that Jesus was saying that there are some who will find out that God is loving while living this life. Yet others will not, and God will make a clear line of distinction between them. Yet that doesn't mean they will be sent to eternal torment in hell. It could mean that they are pulled aside before entering heaven so someone can tell them that God is loving. Then they can make the decision to see that God truly is loving since he lets them into heaven. That's all. It doesn't mean that they're sent to eternal torment in hell. It might have also been the warning listed in Matthew chapter 23. That's the warning that they should see God as loving and live from that love and not from angst. The Israeli leaders refused to see God as loving and lived from their angst and later fought the Romans due to that angst. The Romans conquered them and burned their bodies in the valley of Hinnom. So that also means these verses are a reference to a one-time event and not eternal torment or a far-off future event. I've even heard Jewish folks talk about reading those verses and they consider it to mean the same thing. They saw it as pointing to 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. I think I've heard Dr. Eaton Barr mention that this was his view of Matthew 25.
Yeah, I think even I've heard Eaton Barr say that too. I've also read Brad Jersak's views on Matthew 25, which it was similar. I think we might be running out of time for this episode, so as for now, I'd like to say that my friend Mr. Anonymous wrote a couple of books that touch on these issues. The first book where he talked about it a little bit was titled Why I Had to Consider Universal Reconciliation. He talked a bit about hell in that book and gave more reasons to have doubts about the traditional views of hell. He also listed several other books at the end of that book. He listed a few other books about universal reconciliation and a few books on the hell issue as well. Here's those lists of books. On the issue of universal reconciliation, the books are these. 1. Universalism, the First 500 Years by J. W. Hansen. 2. The Great Dance by C. Baxter Kruger. 3. Jesus and the Undoing of Adam by C. Baxter Kruger. 4. The Evangelical Universalist by Robin Perry. 5. Christ Triumphant by Thomas Allen. 6. Hope for All by Gerry Beauchemin. 7. That All Shalt Be Saved by David Bentley Hart. And 8. The Inescapable Love of God by Thomas Talbot. The books on the hell issue are these. 1. Hope Beyond Hell by Gerry Beauchemin. 2. Hell's Illusion by Don Keathley. 3. Raising Hell by Julie Furwerda. 4. Her Gates Will Never Be Shut by Brad Jersak. 5. The Question of Hell by Richard Murray. You can find that also on his website for free as an ebook download. Number 6. Hell is a Mistranslation by John Lilley. 7. That All Shalt Be Saved by David Bentley Hart. 8. The Christian Doctrine of Apokatastasis by Ilaria, Ramelli. Number 9. Hell, A Jewish Perspective on a Christian Doctrine by Dr. Eaton Barr. So right now, before we end the show, let me give you a word of encouragement. Remember that no matter how bad your life gets, God always loves you and nothing will thwart His love. Even if you have great difficulties, remember what Corrie ten Boom used to say, "There's no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still." I think we should all try to remember that. As for now, I'm Lenny Manning, host of the Agape Guy Show, saying, I hope to see you in the next episode of the show. Goodbye for now.
I'm banking everything on love. I'm banking everything on love. I see the flags unfurl and they're blowing the other way. I see the anchor